The evening station lights trembled in the coastal wind like lanterns forced to rehearse a panic they had not been trained for. Marilyn Monroe stepped from the car onto the platform long after the city had begun folding itself into night, her coat pulled tight against the sea chill. The year had disguised itself as ordinary, but the platform knew better. Some hours carried more consequence than calendars admitted. The air tasted like unmade decisions. The train she was meant to board was one of those red-lined midnight routes that carried the Hollywood elite through landscapes they seldom looked at, and yet she stood there alone, a woman whose presence magnetized too much attention elsewhere to feel comfortable here. She spent most of her public life being observed, but tonight she needed the opposite, space wide enough to hear her own thinking before the train swallowed it. She held the ticket between her fingers like a fragile truth. It was supposed to take her north, toward a weekend retreat arranged by people who wanted her present for reasons that had nothing to do with peace, rest, or her own will. The retreat had been described in neat business-minded terms, an obligation designed to look like leisure. But Marilyn had learned long ago that invitations wrapped in politeness often hid expectations wrapped in iron. Even so, she stood waiting, not because she wanted to go, but because she hadn't yet found an exit that didn't require setting something else on fire. The station benches were occupied by a few worn souls drifting through the edges of travel. The elderly, the exhausted, the men in coats too thin for the season, life pressing them into corners of anonymity. They sat with hunched shoulders, guarding their luggage like memories no one had asked them to share. The station smelled of old iron, stale coffee, and stories dissolving in silence. Marilyn kept her face mostly lowered beneath the tilt of her hat. Fame had a way of turning even ordinary nights into public trials, and the chill that followed her here wasn't from the ocean wind. Fame escorted her everywhere like an uninvited witness. She walked toward the far end of the platform, the side the overhead bulbs almost forgot, when she noticed the man sitting near the emergency ladder, legs drawn close, clutching a small paper bag to his chest. He wasn't old, but he carried the posture of someone who had aged too quickly under weight he hadn't chosen. His clothes were cheap but not careless. His face was exhausted but not defeated. And his eyes, those were what stopped her. They darted toward the station clock every few seconds, like some invisible deadline was tightening around his ribs. He was waiting for something more than a train, something that frightened him. The wind cut through the station again, and the man pulled his jacket tighter, glancing toward the staircase that led out of the rail yard, as if expecting someone to emerge. No one did, but fear did not need witnesses to breathe. Marilyn watched him the way she observed everything when she allowed herself to be human instead of icon. There was a tremor in his hand, not cold, anxiety. Something had pushed him to the edge of flight. She recognized that shape of fear. She had worn similar shapes before the world had learned her name. The loudspeaker crackled overhead with its usual metallic indifference. Her train would arrive in 10 minutes. 10 minutes for a decision she didn't want to make. 10 minutes for the station to keep its secrets or spill them. The man shifted, revealing a bruise along the side of his neck, dark, fresh, angry, not from a fall, from someone else's hand. Marilyn's breath tightened. This was no random traveler fleeing a minor trouble. Someone had done that to him, and whoever it was might have been close. She stepped discreetly behind a support beam, watching him as though observing a scene she was not allowed to interrupt. He checked the clock again. 5 minutes. He reached into his pocket for something. A folded train schedule, edges creased, circled sections in pencil. He wasn't merely leaving, he was escaping. The tracks hummed faintly in the distance as the inbound train strained against the gradient. Its lights glowed through the distant haze, cutting traveling wounds into the dark. Marilyn exhaled, a soft breath carved in conflict. She held her ticket between two fingers, feeling the weight of her obligation, her exhaustion, her desire for a night free of choices. But the bruise on the man's neck carried its own demand. Footsteps echoed down the far stairwell, heavy, unhurried, searching. Marilyn's pulse shifted. The man heard them too, his shoulders stiffened. He looked around, panic fraying the edges of his composure. The footsteps were accompanied by low murmurs, men speaking in casual tones that revealed exactly how little urgency they felt. Predators rarely moved with haste, they moved with expectation. Marilyn didn't wait for them to step into view. She stepped away from the beam and crossed the platform toward the man, the decision forming itself faster than thought. Choice had never asked her permission before rewriting her fate. She approached him quietly, her coat moving with soft rhythm, her shadow stretching long under the dim lights. He saw her, startled not by her identity but by proximity. People rarely approach the fearful on purpose. His eyes widened not with recognition but with confusion. She stopped beside him, the arriving train's headlamps throwing sharp white across her profile like a director framing a moment meant for permanence. The wind shook the station again. The men on the stairwell paused. Marilyn reached into her coat, not for defense, for the ticket, the single simple piece of paper that decided where she should vanish to tonight and who might vanish instead. She knew the instant her fingers closed around it that she would not be boarding that train. The ticket represented safety for her. For him, it represented oxygen. The train screeched into the station, brakes shrieking like a warning neither of them could misinterpret. The platform lights flickered with the vibration. Marilyn turned toward the man fully, her face illuminated cleanly, silently, unmasked by the theatrical persona the world insisted she wear. She extended the ticket toward him. A ticket that did not belong to him, yet belonged to him entirely. A ticket that would take him away from whoever was walking down those stairs. A ticket that would erase his trail just long enough to save his life. The men on the stairwell stepped into view at last, hard faces, stiff coats, eyes scanning the platform like predators checking inventory. Marilyn stood still, body angled to shield the man without visibly doing so as the train doors hissed open behind them. For a split second, the world balanced on a hinge, between fear and flight, between danger and decision. The man stared at the ticket, trembling. Frozen by the impossible timing of mercy, Marilyn kept her hand extended, unwavering, steady as truth when truth refused to wait. The train doors chimed. His time was up. She pressed the ticket into his hand. The night exhaled. The escape began. He vanished into the crowd with the ticket clutched in his shaking hand, swallowed by the station's noise and steam, while Marilyn remained standing at the platform's edge with her breathing thin and uneven, watching the place where he had disappeared, the place where danger had followed him like a shadow waiting for a sign. She didn't know his name, didn't know what hunted him, but she knew the feeling in his eyes, fear that had roots, old roots, deep ones, and she knew that the choice she had made couldn't be taken back. She turned away from the platform as the whistle screamed and the train began to move, carrying him away to safety, and for a moment she let herself imagine him reaching another city, stepping into a different life where men didn't chase him, where a single ticket could become a doorway to a future. But as she walked toward the station exit, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, she felt something shift in the air around her, something colder and heavier than the winter night outside. It started as a sensation, like being watched by someone who didn't blink, someone who had patience sharpened to a knife's point. Then she saw them, the two men who had entered the station earlier, the men whose eyes had followed the stranger's trembling hands. They were standing near the information booth now, heads tilted, eyes cutting through the crowd with a predator's precision. They hadn't seen her yet, but she recognized the rigid posture, the coats that bulged unnaturally at the ribs, the stillness that came from knowing exactly what violence you were capable of. She kept walking, keeping her face calm, her breath controlled, but every step she took felt as if the temperature around her dropped another degree. At the door she paused slightly as though adjusting her purse, and she caught their reflection in the glass, one of them turning, noticing her, nudging the other. A coil of dread tightened in her stomach. They had realized the man was gone. They were looking for the last trace of him, and she, without intending to, had become that trace. She stepped out into the icy night, her breath forming small clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared, and she immediately headed into the crowd outside, weaving between people, slipping into pockets of shadow, moving away from the pools of light cast by the street lamps. Her heart beat hard but steady, like the tempo of someone who had run from danger before and learned how to keep running. Behind her she heard the faint slam of the station doors, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate, synchronized. They didn't run. Men like that didn't need to. They stalked. They hunted. She tightened her coat around her and merged with a group of factory workers stepping onto the streetcar, but she didn't board. She simply let the crowd obscure her, then slipped around the back of a delivery truck and into a narrow alley where the wind cut like broken glass. She moved deeper, boots echoing softly on the wet pavement, her breath turning shallow as she reached the far end and peeked around the corner. The men were scanning the street, their faces hardened, frustrated, calculating. She knew they were smart enough to deduce things, where the man might have gone who had been close enough to help him, what details could betray a stranger's escape. She stayed motionless for several seconds, letting their eyes sweep past her hiding place, and then she realized something chilling. One of them was speaking into a small radio transmitter. They weren't alone. Maury were coming. She needed to disappear fast. She slipped back into the alley and took a side door into a closed bakery whose back entrance was always left slightly open for morning shipments, a trick she had learned during late-night shoots when she needed shortcuts home. The interior was dark and smelled of flour and cold ovens. She crossed the room silently, careful not to disturb the stacked trays, and exited through the front, locking the door behind her as quietly as possible. Outside, the street was emptier but not safer. Headlights carved through the falling mist, and her instincts told her that waiting too long in any one place would paint a target on her back. She pulled her coat collar up, stepped into the streetlight, and hailed a cab. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, recognizing her instantly. Everyone did, but she placed a finger to her lips, signaling silence. His eyes widened with understanding, and without a word he pressed the accelerator, taking her away from the station, away from the men whose icy trail she had crossed by accident. But even as the cab sped through the sleeping city, Marilyn didn't relax. She kept watching the side streets, watching for suddenly accelerating cars, silhouettes that lingered too long at corners, shadows that moved against the grain of the night. She knew she had been seen leaving the station. She knew they were clever enough to trace a woman as recognizable as her. The cab took her to a quieter neighborhood, a place where street lamps flickered like dying candles, and the houses seemed to lean inward, keeping secrets. She paid the driver and whispered a soft "thank you," then stepped out, boots crunching on thin frost. As she walked toward her apartment, she noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. Its windows were fogged from someone's breath inside. Her own breath caught. They were faster than she thought. She didn't go to her building. Instead, she kept walking past it, pretending she lived farther down, and she turned the corner without looking back. She felt them watching her. The tension in the air hummed like an electric wire ready to snap. For several minutes she walked aimlessly, trying to lose them, circling blocks, changing pace, doubling back through alleys. But every now and then she caught a glimpse of the same car slowly repositioning, crawling like a shadow with wheels. She couldn't go home. Not tonight. She needed a place they couldn't predict, somewhere she could use the darkness to her advantage, somewhere she wouldn't be trapped. Her thoughts rushed, calculating escape routes until a dim memory surfaced. The abandoned rail yard near the old freight line, a maze of rusted cars and empty warehouses, a place with hiding spots, blind corners, enough cluttered terrain to confuse even trained pursuers. She tightened her gloves and set her path toward it. The walk was long, wind slicing across her cheeks, but she moved with determination, her silhouette lit only by the occasional passing car. When she finally reached the rail yard fence, she slipped through a gap in the metal and entered the wasteland of broken machinery and towering train skeletons. The night swallowed her instantly. Here sounds echoed strangely. Her footsteps bounced off steel, distant metal groans vibrated through the air, and the faint hum of the city felt miles away. She chose the path between two dark freight cars and pressed her back against the cold steel, forcing her breath to slow, listening. Then she heard it, the sound of a car engine cutting off. A door closing, two more. They had followed her. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, but her panic sharpened into clarity. She scanned the yard. Shadows twisted across the tracks, creating pockets of invisibility she could slip into. She moved carefully, silently, becoming part of the labyrinth. But the men were persistent. Their voices carried through the metal graveyard, short commands, terse instructions, the tone of people used to hunting living targets. Flashlights flickered on. Beams of white sliced through the darkness, probing every crevice. She ducked behind a pile of wooden crates, heart hammering so hard she feared they would hear it. A flashlight passed inches from her face. She didn't breathe. When it moved away, she darted toward an old switching tower, climbing the metal ladder slowly, each rung icy under her fingers. From the top she could see the men spreading out, their search widening, methodical. She crouched low behind the broken railing, trying to calculate her next move. Then she saw something that twisted fear into something colder. They weren't just searching randomly. They were following a path, a pattern, her pattern. They knew exactly how far she'd run. They were closing in. And one of them, the one with the scar under his eye, looked up straight toward the tower. She froze. His flashlight rose slowly. A beam of white began to climb the metal frame. She inhaled sharply. He was tracking her. He knew she was there. And as the light neared her hiding spot, her instincts screamed one thing: run. Marilyn could feel the weight of the entire station pressing inward as she moved deeper into the industrial corridors where the public never walked, the hum of transformers and ancient cables creating a low growl that seemed to follow her like a warning. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that the man she had saved had already been cornered at the far edge of the old freight yard, where abandoned railcars rusted like forgotten chapters of the city's failures. He had run until the world narrowed into a dead end of steel and wet gravel, and the men hunting him stepped from the shadows with the quiet confidence of wolves who believed the night belonged to them. He clutched the train ticket she had given him. its edges damp from sweat and rain, the ink beginning to bleed like a story refusing to stay whole. He had never imagined someone like her would intervene, much less sacrifice her own escape for his, and now every breath he took felt like he owed the universe an explanation he didn't have time to give. Marilyn pushed forward through a maze of dim hallways, guided only by the distant sound of boots against concrete and the metallic echo of something heavy being dragged. She followed those sounds not because she was fearless, but because she had decided fear was a luxury she refused to carry while someone else's life depended on her. Her heels slipped on slick patches of oil, and the air tasted of old smoke and cold iron. She knew the station above still buzzed with travelers unaware of the storm unfolding below their feet, a storm she had willingly stepped into because the truth, once it pulls you in, does not let go. She reached a grated doorway just as a gust of night air surged through it, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain and danger, and beyond the grate she saw the expanse of the abandoned freight yard, stretching out like a battlefield waiting to declare a winner. The men had the stranger surrounded now. Their flashlights drew pale circles across his chest, turning him into a trembling silhouette framed by rusting boxcars. His pulse hammered against the edges of the moment as he weighed every impossible option left to him. They preferred him alive, but not for mercy. Alive men talked, confessed, recited the scripts these hunters wrote for them. Dead men only needed dirt, but dirt attracted questions, and tonight they weren't in the mood for questions. He was valuable because he had overheard the wrong conversation in a place built to hide everything. He had not been meant to survive the night. But then came Marilyn Monroe, an impossible disruption, a flicker of light in a world that thrives on swallowing light whole. Marilyn slipped through the grate, the cold metal scraping her palm as she pushed herself into the rain-soaked yard. The storm had returned in full force, the downpour turning the space between her and the men into a shimmering curtain of chaos. She moved low between the freight cars, her breath tight in her chest, her hands trembling not from fear but from the enormity of what she had chosen to do. The stranger's life, once anonymous and distant, had become a thread woven around her own, and she could no more walk away now than she could stop breathing. Her dress clung to her skin, heavy with water, but she kept going, guided by instinct and something deeper, a determination that did not match the fragile image the world insisted upon her. Marilyn saw them just as lightning cracked across the sky, freezing the scene in violent white. The hunted man on the ground, one of the pursuers raising a steel tool above him like a verdict about to be delivered. That flash showed her everything, their faces hard and eager, the man's eyes wide with resignation, the truth of the moment raw and irreversible. She stepped out from behind the railcar, her silhouette forming a sharp line against the storm, and though she couldn't overpower them physically, the storm itself seemed to pause, waiting to see what she would do. And what she did was move, fast, fearless, grabbing a fallen metal rod from the gravel without hesitation. She struck the side of a railcar with all her strength, creating a thunderous clang that ricocheted through the yard like a warning shot delivered by the night itself. The men jerked toward the sound, their formation fracturing just long enough for the stranger to scramble backward, gasping, crawling out of the kill zone. Marilyn stepped into full view now, rain streaking down her face in clean lines that made her look carved from defiance itself. The men stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. She was not supposed to be here, not supposed to matter, not supposed to understand how this world operated. But she understood enough. Corruption writes its own rules, and rule breakers are punished unless someone decides the rules don't deserve obedience. And tonight Marilyn decided exactly that. The men advanced toward her, slow and deliberate, their confidence returning with each step. Marilyn felt the fear rise, but she buried it. Grounding herself in the same force that had driven her into the tunnels in the first place, the knowledge that sometimes the only way to save a life is to stand between it and whatever wants to erase it. She lifted the metal rod, not as a weapon, but as a declaration that she would not move. The storm wind whipped her hair into wild arcs, turning her into something feral, something resolute, something they had underestimated for the last time. And then, without warning, the yard erupted in blinding white as a train, silent until that moment, rolled across the far track, its massive form splitting the landscape like a drawn blade. The men scattered just enough for the stranger to limp toward the moving train, desperation turning into momentum. Marilyn motioned him forward with a fierce urgency, her heart pounding with the kind of hope that hurts. He reached the rail just as the last passenger car clattered past and grabbed the handle, his body swinging upward in a single, impossible motion. He disappeared into the motion blur of escape, the train carrying him into the dark horizon that had nearly claimed him. And just like that, he was gone, the ticket she'd given him now a lifeline fully lived. The men turned back to Marilyn, fury replacing calculation, but the sudden blare of approaching sirens cut through the yard like a divine intervention. Someone up in the station must have heard the commotion, the clash of metal, the shouts, the echoes bouncing through the tunnels. The men vanished into the shadows with practiced ease, unwilling to risk exposure. Marilyn stood alone in the rain, heart heaving, legs trembling, the metal rod slipping from her fingers as the storm began to ease. She did not collapse. She simply breathed, letting the reality of what she'd done settle into her bones. Soon the authorities would arrive and find nothing but a woman in a rain-drenched dress standing between abandoned railcars, a woman who would offer no details, no explanations, because the truth belonged to the man she had saved. Her story would be the train she didn't take so that someone else could. She would return to the station anonymous, quiet, unnoticed, as though she had simply walked away for a moment and re-entered the world unchanged. But the world had changed, even if no one saw it. Marilyn had rewritten the fate of a stranger with nothing but courage and timing, and as she walked back toward the lights of the main terminal, she felt the weight of the night lift. She had given away her way out so someone else could find theirs. And in that exchange, quiet, dangerous, unseen, she became something the world never fully understood. A woman who saved lives not by being a star, but by acting in the dark where stars are needed most.